Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome also from my side to our two-day event on doing biodiversity, experimental knowledge transformations on sustainable futures. As Frank already said, my name is Tanja Bogusz. I'm a sociologist and currently a senior fellow at the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies here at Hamburg University. We organized this workshop together with Frank Adloff and the persons Frank named already. And as a start, let me briefly introduce you on the topic of the workshop. So why doing biodiversity and why experimental knowledge transformations? Planetary biodiversity loss, along with climate change and consistently entangled with it, represents one of the major global challenges today. Today, scientists and intergovernmental organizations accumulate alarming alerts on the situation. To quote just the latest media release from the first IPBES and IPCC joint workshop report published some weeks ago, I quote, "Transformative change in all parts of society and our economy is needed to stabilize our climate, stop biodiversity loss, and chart a path to the sustainable future we want," end of quote. However, such transformation, we think, not only requires good and sound research, but also a collaborative spirit between the social and the natural sciences, as well as between science, politics, and society. It requires time, curiosity for the unknown, and being prepared to leave, at least occasionally, our professional containers with an open mind. It also requires to be prepared for risk, unsettlement, failure, and surprise. This is not so much a theoretical question, but merely a practical one. Facing the ecological crisis consists in the idea of an experimental doing as a form of commitment and enactment of biodiversity as a natural as well as a societal issue. If the scope of the challenge happens to be rather intimidating, the approach of our workshop is, however, modest. To overcome the social ecological limits of our times, we invite for experiencing mutual learning beyond established socio-ecological fragmentation. For its inter as well as transdisciplinary outreach, the two-day workshop is organized twofold. Tomorrow, we assemble round about 30 citizen scientists, sociologists, naturalists, entrepreneurs, anthropologists, marine biologists, and artists in inter and transdisciplinary learning cabinets. Tonight, we want to get acquainted with the core issues at stake when we leave our disciplinary and professional rooms. We are delighted to discuss modes of knowing and treating biodiversity loss with two personalities who will now share their expertise and insights from their respective practices and disciplines with us, as researchers, but as I suppose also as concerned citizens. Sociologist Professor Claire Waterton and marine biologist Helmut Hillebrand. Claire Waterton is a professor for sociology at Lancaster University, UK. Professor Waterton has a science and technology studies and a feminist background. As a leading figure on critical social research on the Anthropocene, she's also a specialist on sociological research on biodiversity loss. She has led many empirical research projects linking science studies, policy, management, and public collaboration, and published numerous articles around these issues. For the purpose of our workshop topic, I'd like to highlight especially the book Barcoding Nature, Shifting Cultures of Taxonomy in an Age of Biodiversity Loss, co-directed with Rebecca Ellis and Brian Wynn in 2013, the special issue on environmental sociology entitled Conceptual Innovation in Environmental Sociology, co-directed with Rolf Litzkog in 2016, and her long-term community Loweswater care project in the English Lake Cumbrian district, where the abundance of blue-green algae became a matter of local concern since the 1990s. Welcome, Claire. We are honored to have you here tonight. Algae, and more specifically those we can find in the oceans, are also a core topic for our second guest, Professor Helmut Hillebrand. Helmut Hillebrand is the director of the Helmholtz Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity in Oldenburg, Germany, and Professor for Plankton Ecology at Oldenburg University. As a renowned researcher on biodiversity change and ecological stability, he is also well known for his expertise on the human impact on ecosystem transformation and thus for societal issues. Professor Hillebrand was and is principal investigator in projects focusing on, for instance, sustainable management for coasts and oceans, their conservation and monitoring. Among his long publication list in internationally leading scientific journals, let me note two co-authored papers. Rapid Reorganization of Global Biodiversity, published in Science in 2019, or Environmental and Trade Variability, Constrained Community Structure, and the Biodiversity Productivity Relationship, published in Ecology in 2016. Welcome, Helmut, and many thanks for joining us tonight. Now some technical details before Helmut will start his talk. As the center records the two inputs given by our two guests, this part of our session is organized as a webinar, which means that only Claire Waterton, Helmut Hillebrand, and I are on stage. When we open the floor for the public discussion, you will be invited to participate as discussants, and if you like, you can also show up on the screen. Please note that this procedure will take a little moment. The public part would not be recorded. So now the floor is yours, Mr. Hillebrand.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much for this nice introduction and for the invitation. Thanks for all participants joining tonight and engaging with us about interdisciplinary approaches to biodiversity change. So it is my pleasure to start this session with my presentation, and I'm very excited for Claire's presentation afterwards and the interaction that might come based on that. I start my presentation with highlighting the Sustainable Development Goal 14, life below water, for a marine ecologist like me is kind of the closest to my research. And it is written as conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. And whereas, of course, the intention of this SDG is very clear and very much supportable, it actually has a number of aspects which need a critical discussion. And for those of you who don't have a lot of time today, the take-home message of my talk is that these critical aspects can only be solved by a close collaboration between very different approaches. So where do we stand in our trial to achieve SDG 14? This is a paper by Jones et al., published 3 years ago in Current Biology. And they undertook an endeavor to map where in the ocean we still have conditions which we would call wilderness. So rather unaffected by humans. And whereas the blue areas which indicate wilderness seem to be large on this map, that is actually a projection issue because most of these areas are polar, so their size is actually small. And if you calculate the proportion, it is down to 13%. So although we perceive the ocean as a vast, untouched environment, that is completely untrue. The red bounded lines here on this map is the exclusive economic zones. So the areas of the oceans where nations have exclusive rights to rule about uses and protection. And you see that almost none of them are to be classified as wildernesses. The green areas are MPAs, so marine protected areas. And even there you see that also the marine protected areas are mostly in areas which are actually massively transformed by humans. And of course, we know that this has effects on life in these areas. That is the foundation of the talks tonight and the workshop tomorrow. And one of my favorite papers of all times is has been produced by Heike Lotze and her team. They looked at historical and recent scientific information about the relative remaining abundance of major marine organism groups. So what they did from cultural periods, from hunter-gatherer to globalization, was to estimate pre-human population sizes, set them to 100%, and then see how much of that is still remaining. And you can see that in almost all groups, may it be marine mammals, marine birds, fish, reptiles, invertebrates, or macrophytes, we see a strong reduction. The data come from 12 coastal areas, which have quite solid historical data as well, mainly from European and North American coasts. So obviously there is something really dreadful happening, and we are losing a lot of the precious marine life on our planet, which has led to developing a program culminating into setting the so-called AG targets for halting this biodiversity loss. And in 2014, Derek Tittensor and colleagues published a paper where they gave us a hint of how we are doing in our endeavor to reduce pressures and improve the state of biodiversity. And their estimate was that we are actually doing really, really bad. They took the 2010 values for different measures of human pressures and of different measures of biodiversity states as the baseline, and they found that actually the pressures are increasing and the status is decreasing over time, even after the targets have been set. And last year in the Global Biodiversity Outlook, this is a Convention on Biological Diversity gave an assessment of the progress towards these 20 Aichi targets, which were meant to be filled by 2020. And this is probably much too small to read, and it's also not about the details. For each of the 20 targets, the half circles give you some indication of how we have been doing in achieving these. Blue and green are the positives, where we are on track or even better. Yellow, there's some progress, but not as fast as we promised. Red is no change, and violet is even going into the completely wrong direction. Without seeing the details, if you just look at the colors, I think the impression of this figure is very clear. There is very little progress towards a achievement of the biodiversity targets. And when this report was published, the media response was accordingly. So here are only two headlines. New Scientist talked about a massive failure, and also the Guardian concluded that humanity is at a crossroads after a decade in which all of the 2010 Aichi goals have been missed. So we were not able to fulfill a single of these goals. Although we essentially know what we would need to do, here is a nice paper which has been published last year in Nature, which is about terrestrial biodiversity. And what you see here on this diagram is on the x-axis, the time scale. On the y-axis, you see some indicator value for biodiversity. The 2010 value again is set as a reference point to 0. And in the title of that paper, we have, or Leclerc et al. Said, what we have to do is to bend the curve. To bend the curve away from this negative dynamics into something which is at least halting the decline or even improving that. And they came up with a number of scenarios which are color-coded here to the right, and mechanisms, and the range of these bars to the right is the range of potential impacts you could get depending on different impact scenarios. This is a terrestrial figure, and all of these management scenarios are based on land use change, because land use is the one single most important aspect of terrestrial biodiversity loss. We are a little bit in a more complicated situation in the marine sciences, because in the marine world, changing area is actually not what we do in the ocean. We are extracting food in form of fish, and we are polluting it, and we are changing the pH value, and we heat it up, but we don't change the area. So in contrast to terrestrial scenario building, our scenarios are often multidimensional and much more complex than reducing land loss, land conversion, and so on. Nevertheless, the steps Leclerc et al. Put out, and I would completely subscribe to that, is that what we need to do is to understand the change that has happened and its causes, to predict future changes and what they mean for how ecosystems work, develop a multitude of management scenarios which give us options, and then discuss transformative concepts that allow us to select sustainable management for conserving biodiversity. So this is perfect, and essentially what we should do is go out and do these 4 steps. However, that is much easier said than done, and I will come with 2 rather unpopular statements. The first one is that we actually don't really know what is changing in biodiversity, and our prediction capacity is extremely low, especially in the ocean. This is counteracting arguments which I've often heard, that the science especially is done, and we only need to use that scientific knowledge we have to make good management or to make to inform societal discussions, selecting for policies and management options. By contrast, I will spend 2 slides following this one on showing that what we know about biodiversity change is actually extremely superficial. The second unpopular statement is that we actually don't really have good biodiversity targets. Contrasting, for example, our climate targets, where we say we want to have a global warming below 1.5 or 2.0 degrees Celsius. Our biodiversity targets are a simplistic cartoon of what a real target would look like. And as they are formulated, they are extremely inoperable. The reason for this, for me, is that the different disciplines we would need to make a better understanding of biodiversity and better biodiversity targets is too rarely happening. And overcoming this is actually requiring much more interdisciplinary actions. So what do I mean with these statements? Starting with the natural sciencey one, the understanding the biodiversity one. I showed you, for example, this from the paper by Lotze et al. And it seems that there's an almost collapsing biodiversity on this slide. But when you actually measure the number of species in any local habitat over time, what you see is no strong change. Actually, the average slope is even positive. So this slightly complex graph here gives you, on the x-axis, the slope of species richness over time. So 0 means there's no change, 0.02 means that there is a 2% increase, that there is an increase in the number of species. Negative values means that there is a decrease in the number of species. The dotted line is the 0. The solid line is the average, and it's done for freshwater, terrestrial, and marine systems at polar, temperate, and tropical latitudes. But that doesn't really change a lot. So why is this? Why is this that we have a global biodiversity decline, but we only have neutral to even positive changes in local number of species? Or to put it with Supertramp, an all-star band of scientists making this album a few decades ago, the album is called Crisis, What Crisis? So what is the biodiversity crisis in here? And how can we argue around biodiversity change? And the big misunderstanding is that we think that this global processes affecting biodiversity will simply be mirrored by a linear reflection in local biodiversity. But that is actually not true. And there are many reasons for that. One of the major reasons is a basis of a paper which a postdoc of our group, Lucy Koshinsky, is currently preparing, where she looks at net differences between colonization and extinction. So consider there's an habitat changing, and in that habitat, colonization is going quickly because you only need a few individuals for establishing a new species. But extinction takes time because species first have to become rare. They might actually survive as very rare species for very long times. What you would expect is that colonization is actually much faster than extinction. So the whole assumption of these analyses looking at biodiversity trends in forms of richness or other simple variates measuring biodiversity are based on an equilibrium view of communities, whereas the communities might actually be in disequilibrium for most of their time. And that would give you, even though in this cartoon here, colonization and extinction at the end are in equilibrium and you shouldn't see any change in species richness, for most of the time of observation, you would actually see more species than you would expect. You could also have the counter issue where extinction is faster than colonization, for example, in a very isolated island or very isolated marine habitat, where extinction is fast and colonization is slow. And then you might actually see losses of diversity, even so you do something positive in this environment. So biodiversity change is often mirrored or is often measured in the form of very simple univariate metrics, but they might be very misleading in what actual biodiversity trajectories are doing. And biodiversity is more than just counting the number of species. The presence of a certain species always means that it has a certain genetic and physiological capacity, that it has an evolutionary history which constrain its functions, that it has a certain mobility and ability to change if its distribution, if conditions change. So it's actually the species identity which carries all of this information, not the species richness. And this is a paper I published with colleagues from South Africa where we looked at coastal time series. And again, a quick update, the x-axis is the difference in the number of species between two time points in the same location. The y-axis is the proportion of species being exchanged. So 0 means none, and 1 means 100% different species setup. And if you just focus here on the left-hand side of this graph, you'll see that without a single change in the number of species, you can have everything between 0 and almost 100% exchange of species identities. And if you take relative dominance into account, you see that there is this huge block of data points where without seeing any change in richness, the entire community is conversed into something different. For the second aspect, the simplicity of biodiversity targets, I produced the three main discussions which are going on. One is to set thresholds for diversity loss. And the planetary boundaries discussion is one example for this. So you see here biosphere integrity is one of the sectors here in this planetary boundary diagram. And the idea is that we can be safe in a safe operating space if biodiversity integrity is only partly affected, and then it becomes high risk at these outer bounds of this sketch. And while some of the science behind these figures is really great and brings in a lot of complexity, there are a number of open questions. So how much biodiversity loss do we actually accept as a threshold? it's completely unclear at which scale these thresholds operate. Is that local, or is that regions, or is that global? It's also unclear what baseline it is compared to, because biodiversity is never static. And I recently published a paper with a group of authors showing that in most of the empirical data, these thresholds actually are not, cannot be derived from the data. So we have no knowledge where this threshold between safe and non-safe actually is. No net change has also been suggested, so that extinctions and immigration should actually keep balance. As I just showed before, that is a very unrealistic assumption, and it's actually also not happening anywhere. It potentially has never existed on Earth, a no net change scenario. And it is extremely complicated again, because it's unclear at which scale this actually happens. Is that meant to be measured at regional scales, continental scales, or only at the planetary scale? And the other third thing is something which you probably have seen as well, protecting a certain percentage of ocean area. This is the 30 by 30 initiative, so 30% of the ocean by 2030. And of course, we would potentially do something good by doing so, but as a target, it's extremely questionable again. First of all, in a completely fluid system like the ocean, area protection might not always be the right approach. But even if we buy in on area protection as the one thing we want to do, how do we prioritize this? Do we prioritize where we find most species, where we find the rarest species, where we have the highest human impacts? Unfortunately, history has shown that often the prioritization is choosing areas where it doesn't disturb other activities. Conserving of the leftovers of economic interests. And that is something I've thought about quite a bit lately, is who actually addresses aspects of equity and justice in there. So where would these 30% be? It's obviously not in developed countries, global north countries, coastlines, because we have rocked down our coastlines so much that there's not much space for MPAs anymore. So we are actually, we are potentially actually talking about areas which are rather in the global south. And this actually has a lot of consequences. There's this very nice paper by Trizos et al., which came out a few weeks ago on decolonizing ecology. And this is something which poses a lot of problems in this 30 by 30 goal. So how can we avoid this failure, and what would we have to do? I have two slides which have more or less the same message. I present them both. The first slide is based on a very short and, as I think, really fantastic paper by the late Georgina Mace. It's called Whose Conservation? And it gives a short history of conservation science on just 2 pages. If I can give a reading recommendation, I strongly recommend this one. Perhaps one of the clear-sightedest environmental scientists we ever had. She gives this historical account, and she says conservation of biodiversity has gone through certain phases, and it started with the key idea to protect wilderness, to protect species. And the science which we did for that was mainly looking at species, their preferences, their habitats, and so on. Then we had the 70s, 80s, where the phase she called Nature Despite People. And here it was all these doom, extinction and habitat loss and pollution and overexploitation. And much what we looked at scientifically was the biology of populations and how rarity affects the ability of a species to survive and so on. Then we had this phase where we had nature for people, where ecosystem services became a buzzword, where we looked at the economic value of nature, where things like ecosystem functions and environmental economics became a very strong aspect of this consideration. And only in this last phase, which she called People and Nature, we actually thought about nature as a socio-ecological system, and starting to question interdisciplinarily how human behavior and ecosystem or biodiversity change are actually interacting with each other. I made my version of this narrative, which I also would like to change, and also describes a little bit my personal history in this field. So as a natural scientist, I'm extremely interested in understanding how a changing environment alters the functioning of ecosystems. And the functioning is described by ecosystem processes such as producing oxygen, the oxygen we breathe, cycling of material, carbon drawdown. And most of these processes are actually biological processes. And by being biological processes, they are directly affected by who is there, by the biodiversity and the genetic physiological potential it stands for. And this has kept me busy essentially since my postdoc, trying to understand how much of this ecosystem response is actually due to direct effects of rising temperatures, and how much is due to changing biodiversity and adaptations to these new conditions. Then in the last 20 years or 15 years perhaps, we have started to link this functional role of biodiversity, what we call now nature's contribution to people. So that can be, for example, provisioning services like food, but it can also be tourism, for example. It can be the climate mitigation, which is coming from this carbon drawdown in the ecosystems, and so on. And graphs like this have been published in every second European Union call on global change projects. And there is an obvious miss in here. And this obvious miss is us. And there's also a logical flaw in here because it links ecosystem processes to nature contributions to people. But it's actually not the ecosystem deciding what a nature contribution to people is, it's us. And it's also us making the decisions that lead to global change. So this requires to have social sciences involved here to think about values, to think about politics and power relations, to think about historical contingency of these decisions. And without taking this into account, my start and my end of my natural scientist consideration is a black box. So in order to bring this together, we have to develop research agendas which allow us to address biodiversity change in such an interdisciplinary context. So with my two statements here, what I would like to speak for is to integrate social and natural science approaches. And with social sciences, I mean them in the largest potential definition you can think of, including arts and humanities. And to bring this into a circle where actually the driving aspects are to understand how biodiversity is changing and how operational targets can be developed. Without knowing what's changing, a target is useless, and without a target, management cannot influence biodiversity change accordingly. And on the web page of the newly founded Helmut Institute, we are just 4 years old. Our entry page starts with the statement that we want to work towards a bigger picture, and independent of all the discussions we might have afterwards, if you're interested in this institute, on our webpage, you can, for example, also subscribe to a newsletter which comes quarterly and informs about the research we are doing. And with that, I would like to end my talk and hand over to Claire.
Thank you very much, Helmut, for this very inspiring and rich talk. So we will hand over directly to Claire. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Great. Oh, Helmut, thank you so much for that that really interesting talk. And I really much enjoyed the way you kind of critically opened up, unpacked the kinds of statements that we might, ordinarily hear from an ecological point of view. I'm going to be talking about a process whereby we did some similar kinds of unpacking. My talk's about one defined project where I was one of the people in a group, and I was sort of responsible, if you like, for bringing in different kinds of methods, interdisciplinary methods, into an existing kind of what I would call a sort of assemblage or combination of people and things. So kind of in the people and nature scenario that Helmut just outlined. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see some of the people and things that I'm going to be talking about, including on the left, some blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. The lake, you can see, this is called Loweswater. It's a place in Cumbria where I was working for several years. And you can also see in the little boxes, people talking in the village hall, in the village that surrounds this lake. And the village is also called Loweswater. So, go to the next slide. So Loweswater is a small village situated around a lake in an upland area of northwest England, in the Lake District, an area that's designated as a national park due to its natural and its ecological beauty. And you can see here on this slide what kind of place Loweswater is to a certain extent visually. There are 13 farms that surround the lake. There are about 40 dwellings, so houses, which you can't see in this picture, but they are there in this, what we call this catchment, the area which drains into the lake. And you can see some sheep there, and sheep and beef agriculture are the main land uses around the lake. And around this, in this village, there's a very interesting population of retired professionals, farmers and farm families, and rather fewer sort of younger people. So it's quite an elderly population. In a way, it's a typical Lake District catchment. But the lake that looks so pristine and beautiful in this picture became eutrophic in the early 2000s. And at that time, Loweswater came to be seen as a place with a problem. The lake became eutrophic, as I've said. That means it was affected by an excess of nutrients getting into the water, and it was increasingly subject to these blue-green algal blooms, which you see here, which, as the sign says, may be toxic. So in the early 2000s, ecologists were working around this problem, trying to bring together land and water ecology. So for them, this was itself a form of interdisciplinarity. So terrestrial ecologists talking to aquatic ecologists. They wanted to see why these blooms were appearing, try to understand the connections from land to water, and they were trying to work out what was getting into the water, what was causing the water to bloom in this way, this green bloom. Their thinking was that what they call the limiting factor was phosphorus, a nutrient that was flowing into the lake and causing these blooms, allowing these cyanobacteria to thrive. And so they got kind of that far, but at a certain point, they wanted to include social scientists into their team. And they reached out to the Centre for the Study of Environmental Change, which is where I work in Lancaster University in the sociology department. So I became part of a team which was already sort of populated by ecologists mostly and farmers in 2004. And I brought to this team a background of using sort of theoretical insight, so social theory, from the discipline of Science and Technology Studies, or STS. And I used this STS theory to open out the idea of what was going on in the lake. The idea that phosphorus flows were going from land to water was the idea that the ecologists were putting forward. But it was an idea also that was very upsetting to local residents because they felt that the phosphorus was coming from farms around the lake. And so it kind of upset local relationships between residents and farmers. So an early response from myself as an STS researcher interested in the sociology, of knowledge making, was to think about the way that ecological knowledge may have been able to capture some aspects of what is happening here, but also may have particular constraints that come through its own limits and its own ways of knowing. So sociologists of science are interested in the way that science frames issues, how it selects certain variables and not others, how it delineates the parameters of an observation or of an experiment. And then, of course, there is the question as to whether this framing implies certain exclusions and silences, perhaps. This observation was made by Thomas Kuhn in his work, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He said that insofar as the structure of the world can be experienced and the experience communicated, it's constrained by the structure of the lexicon, the language, if you like, of the community that inhabits it. So communities of practice, so here ecologists, and we also had land and water managers, such as the Environment Agency in England, are enabled, but they're also constrained by their language and their lexicons, their framings. So this observation also creates opportunities. It becomes clear that there may be other questions, social questions, cultural questions, that can be connected up perhaps to an ecological framing and to perhaps inevitable scientific uncertainties of looking at something as complex as a whole catchment ecosystem and what's happening there. So that was one thing we started to think about from STS. The next thing was a related insight, was that the blue-green algae, the issue that was affecting Loweswater, was very much, could be legitimately thought of as a public issue, not only a scientific issue. So ecologists were not the only ones who sort of knew the blue-green algae. But we could see that their way of knowing was dominant because public agencies, for example, the National Parks Authority, the Environment Agency, and so on, rely on ecological knowledge. And we could also see that a controversy was arising around the lake because actually this issue was becoming quite intractable. Although these agencies thought they knew what was the problem, they couldn't really get a grip on it and change the problem round. And at the same time, which was frustrating to local residents and farmers, and at the same time, many other understandings of the catchment and what people thought was happening there were ignored. Bruno Latour, a well-known science studies scholar, was interested in this question as well at the time, the publicness of this issue. And of course, it was a very public issue because the lake kept changing color. People could see that something was happening. He said, the time seems right to shift our attention to other ways of considering public matters. Matters are precisely what might be put center stage. Public matters, but how? So this was a very provocative piece of work by Latour, and it prompted us to think more about it, as I'll tell you in a minute. The third bit of STS thinking that I was able to bring to the group of people working on Loweswater was the idea that maybe we could intervene, maybe we could shape the investigations. We thought we might be able to create a mechanism, a bottom-up mechanism to build on certain aspects. We thought we might be able to think about the frustrations of the local community, the insights that they might bring to the issue, their local knowledges, and the things that hadn't been taken into account. We thought we could create a mechanism that would be driven by a very heterogeneous group, who would be made up of local people, ecologists, local agencies, sociologists, geographers, and other experts. And this mechanism could look at ways of knowing of the scientists and the agencies who were concerned about the changing ecology of the lake. It could start perhaps a different way of doing water quality or doing biodiversity or ecological change in this valley. So the Loweswater Knowledge Collective came out of this idea and was this new mechanism. It began in 2007 It was our term, the researchers' term, that the sociologists, and it was quickly renamed the Loweswater Care Project by its participants in 2008. So they immediately changed their name, didn't like the idea of a collective. So within the Loweswater Care Project, it was proposed and agreed that we should follow some ideas put forward by Bruno Latour, who I was also already mentioned, the philosopher of science. And this idea was that he said that in matters to do with nature, science, with his capital S here, if you can see that, science with a capital S makes nature incontestable and politics impotent. So what he was saying was, we can't now accept that there are these official versions of what's happening that are the whole story. And what he wanted, still looking at the little pink box there, is he wanted us to try to do science with a little s. So propositional experiments and small investigations that would make politics alive, not impotent. So what he said was we should create new collectives. And then he had a load of statements, which I found really interesting. And I'm going to sort of unpack these in a minute. So nature is not self-evident, where knowledge and expertise has to be debated, where it's accepted that uncertainty is the main condition that humans are in, rather than a condition of having knowledge. Where what is important is the creation of connections between people and things, and where doubt and questioning is extended to all our representations. So quite a long list, but let's look at those one by one. So firstly, the connections between, I'm going to take you now through some ways in which we kind of picked out and implemented some of these suggestions by Latour, actually quite literally, in a quite deliberate experiment to see what would happen if we took on his suggestions. So firstly, we deliberately tried to do the creation of connections between people and things. In July 2008, we asked everyone involved in the Loweswater Care Project to bring objects into the village hall that for them signified connections they wanted to make to the lake. So this was an initial way to do what Latour had said, to create connections between people and things. We asked people to talk about what they brought in. So for example, a man on the top right there brought in a small and relatively rare freshwater snail that could be found in this lake. Other people brought items, for example, part of his horse's harness that showed what kind of animals there had been in the catchment in the recent past. And so indicating how the assemblage, if you like, of people and nature in the catchment was changing and how agriculture was changing. So that's one thing that we did. I'm just going to quickly whip through a few of these. More connections between people and things. We found that people in the Loweswater Care Project were very interested in fish declines in the lake. A lot of fishermen were really worried about this. They wanted to know why the composition of the biodiversity of the water was changing. So we had 2 ecologists in the collective, and we used their expertise and their equipment to do acoustic surveys of fish in the lake. More connections between people and things. Here we can see how the Loweswater Care Project allowed for an explicit move, if you like, to support the doing of research, the asking of questions by local people. So to answer the question as to whether domestic, like household detergent use or domestic leakage of sewage was partly responsible for this phosphorus leakage and its eutrophication, the resident Leslie Webb was given some project money to carry out a survey of household detergents, and he actually inspected himself all the septic tanks in the catchment. other residents, ecologists, historians, and local residents used project funds for other inquiries, for example, on the socio-economic aspects of the valley, on sediments, on historical land use and how it had changed, and on the transport of phosphorus through water. So more connections between people and different forms of expertise and different issues of inquiry. All of these projects related back to the Loweswater Care Project meetings, which were held every 2 months. So on this slide, we can see it says at the top that all knowledge and expertise has to be debated. This is one of Latour's ideas in his statement. Some of this knowledge was extremely controversial in a local context. So in this case, each pie chart represents a farm, each of these blocks, and the measurements are of phosphorus in soil. And we had a scientist go and do soil measurements and come up with these graphs. And 3 of the farms were seen to be applying slightly too much phosphorus for the grass to uptake for its growth. The farmers were very worried about this bit of research. They were part of the Loweswater Care Project. And the 3 that were seen to be applying too much phosphorus immediately stopped applying fertilizer. However, these farm figures did assume, I think, and we did discuss this, that all the phosphorus that is applied to grassland is taken up by growth of the grass. Farmers wanted to believe this, but the ecologists wanted to actually unpack this further. And they wanted to see if they could find out what losses of phosphorus there still may be to the watercourse, even if the grass is uptaking phosphorus. So even if safe levels of phosphorus were applied, they suggested, phosphorus may still be lost to watercourses. So the question arose, is there a safe level of phosphorus application in such a kind of a condition that we saw in this catchment, soils, slope, etc. And consistent with our kind of philosophy, a small project was designed to make this question into a project. Okay, so all knowledge and expertise has to be debated. That was another of Latour's stipulations. So we put monitoring and measurements of the lake and of the weather onto the web so that all participants of the LCP could see this scientific data. The LCP philosophy was also that nature and the biodiversity that we might expect to see in such a situation was never to be taken as self-evident. Our philosophy was to be open to surprises, and to keep asking questions. So early on in the project, we found a very surprising number of these creatures, which are phantom midge larvae. These are creatures that can live in very deoxygenated water conditions. So once we found these, we brought this back to the LCP for discussion and started to ask more questions. What did this imply about lake water quality, that so many of these creatures were thriving? How was the species composition of the lake playing an active part in the changes themselves? So how is it building on changes that were already happening? We fostered, as one participant put it, a spirit of inquiry, and we try to build on these kinds of unexpected findings. Another idea of Latour's was that uncertainties are the condition in which we're in. And what we tried to do was to open out uncertainties and to create actions which address them. So in this case, as it says here, the National Trust, who actually owned the lake, so National Trust is a conservation organisation in the UK, a very powerful one, owning a lot of property and land. They worked together with local farmers to clear vegetation around the outflow of the lake. And this was actually a very historic occasion because at the beginning of the project, these two groups, the National Trust and the local farming community, were completely at loggerheads. blaming each other, particularly the National Trust blaming the farmers for the pollution of the lake. So this was really great that they said, you know, in their newsletter, hopefully this will increase the flows of water, keeping back gravels clean, allowing lake levels to drop more quickly, which will reduce flooding at the top end. A lot of people questioned this, but what we were trying to do was to sort of create modest actions where people could work together to try to create some new actions or new knowledge, which we could then discuss. And doubt and questioning had to be extended to all our representations, another stipulation of Latour. Experts and institutions and their knowledge and expertise were treated in the Loweswater Care Project as equally valuable to that of residents and farmers. All knowledge in the group was questioned, for example, in this whole evening where we spent asking questions of the formal institutions like the water authorities, the Environment Agency, the National Parks Authority, and so forth, were all sort of subject, if you like, to questions by the group. So we did this for 3 years. We had these meetings every 2 months, and we kept designing and thinking about our own questions as a group, and then putting into play little investigations and then bringing the results back. So now I want to just think about what was all this about, what happened. So as intended in a way, this is not science that kind of told us what to do, but it was an investigation which you might say had a little s, science, which involved a sort of new politics, which was all around the blue-green algae, this visible public problem. It did bring forth, I think, a real feel for connecting and for relations and for thinking about what is the extent of this problem. And it brought about, in the third bullet point, a much more of a sense that we were connecting the ecological relations to social relations. So we could talk about socio-natures or the fact that these things are deeply interrelated, and participants began to be quite fluent in doing that. What we did was we started to create collective or situated knowledge making, often based on citizen science or citizen sensing or citizens working with other experts around the issues that they felt to be important. And we also, I think, started to think about the inequalities around the lake, as well as the ecological health of the lake. So we began to think about changes in agriculture, changes in policy, changes that the farming community might have to do, and what would that mean for them. We began to ask the questions of who and what, so which species, not just humans, but which other multi-species win and lose in certain future scenarios. So I think this is my final slide, that what we did was a kind of experiment in a new kind of interdisciplinary work and environmental governance. It was very kind of informed by one piece of work, by Latour's idea about creating new collectives. And that helped us kind of develop our own response to that. So it came to be about knowledge, but also about participation and about science with a large or a small s, and politics and how we could do those things together. What was definitely clear was that research was kind of slowed down, it was kind of thickened up, and new questions were asked. And also that we folded in more issues and questions as we went along through the 3 years. There are some accounts in science studies and in STS that argues that this is good science. It's not a delaying or a hampering of the kind of fast, decisive science. it is good science to open out and broaden out and to decide what are the parameters that still need to be looked at, or perhaps are still invisible that we need to think about. And what's also clear what happened is that some people absolutely thrived on this opening out and slowing down of knowledge making. And they really started to become curious, to think about the ecological relations and to be absolutely fascinated by them, but also to realize that they were in a relationship with history, with society, with agriculture, with culture, and so forth. So some people thrived on that. There are some challenges as well, because some people wanted actually to still have, you know, let's decide what's wrong, decide what to do and sort it out. But of course, this is a very complex issue, diffuse pollution. And so that wasn't always possible. I'll just leave you with a little bit of idea what happened next. The Loweswater Care Project was succeeded by a local group that was funded by the government, that continues now, even though the project funding has ended, to monitor the lake water. And they still lobby for good practices and for kind of thinking about their practices and their relations around the lake. They were able to do some very practical things, for example, installing new tanks for slurry, for cattle slurry, cattle manure. They have recorded that the total soluble phosphorus in the lake is declining. And so the algal blooms are becoming less prominent. And they have also recorded that some fish are starting to spawn again in the gravel beds around the edges of the lake. So it's a really interesting story. It's not a finished story, because there's still, you know, there still are relations of production and productivity in this catchment, and they still do obviously affect the relations, and also the ones that have already changed are not just immediately put back to normal. But so I'll just leave you with that idea that it's a very ongoing problem. Shall I stop sharing? So I can see.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this also very complex and telling impressions of your great research project, which seems to me quite a sort of like maybe a sort of answer or complement to what Helmut at the end of his talk was talking about, and or what he acclaimed to be necessary as a form of engaging science citizens and many different modes of knowledge forms. So we are now at 1920, and I was thinking that it would be nice if both of you would address each of one small short question to one another with a very brief answer, because we want, of course, also open up the floor, and there were already some people who want to ask questions. So if you like, Helmut or Claire, to address a question to one another would be really great, but would be nice if you could be very brief, very short in your questions and also in your answers, so that we have the opportunity also to discuss with the public. Who wants to start, or do you have one of you already a question in your box?
Perhaps daring. A very nice talk, Claire. Thanks for this example. One thing I was asking myself while listening to your talk was this situation with the lake, where the residents, as you said, is a community of often retired persons and so on, might be a very unique opportunity, because in many other situations like this, you often have a very strong economic interest also in a certain aspect. If I think about something similar where it would perhaps be about fisheries, accepting this approach might actually be much more difficult across the broad range of people who have stakes in there, because there's very strong aspects of economics and livelihoods and so on being involved. So would you say that this was kind of a window of opportunity for trying such an approach, because it wasn't so much biased by let's say lobbying groups for certain professions or something like that?
Thanks. Well, there are economic stakes around this catchment, and they are kind of replicated in every valley in the Lake District, and it's becoming a bit of a problem in lots of rural areas, and that farmers are not getting actually very much profit from their enterprises, and at the same time, you know, they're part of an agricultural system possibly quite detrimental to many aspects of biodiversity. So in a way, we were quite listening to the kind of bind, if you like, that the farmers were in, because if we have no farmers in the Lake District, it's a very, very different place. If we have no upland sheep and beef farms in the upland areas of the UK and Europe, then, you know, we have desertification, and we have a different cultural landscape as well as a different natural landscape. So that was a sort of fisherman type comparison that we have here. We have farmers, primary producers, that are using the land in a way that could be problematic, could be done differently, has been done differently in the past. And yet, you know, obviously we need to listen to their economic realities. So it's, yeah, I don't know if it's all that different, especially the primary producers kind of narrative.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Claire, do you have one particular question, or do you think
I just have one? Yeah, I had one little question. I'm not sure if we're going to get very far with it, but I really liked your interrogation of the knowledge systems that are being created to try to tell us what state we're in. I heard very clearly that you said, Helmut, that values, politics, power relations, and the kind of contingency of the facts and the decisions that we make are really important. So it's like, yes, I get that. But your kind of parting gesture was still that we need good targets, and we then we know that we can manage in a certain way. And I just wondered whether you felt, you know, that captures it all. Yeah.
No, it's of course only an aspect, but it's an aspect I'm especially concerned about. All discussions I'm involved in this entire field of biodiversity conservation or management often come to a point where from an ecologist's viewpoint, what is so fascinating about biodiversity is that it is complex, right? It is an extremely complex concept in itself. It has many hierarchical levels, from different genes to different ecosystems. And that is why it's fun, right? That is why I am an ecologist, because it's the beautiful complexity of life. But then if we want to say we have different potential uses or different potential ways of managing a system, it often boils down to saying what is a tolerable change, or what is a target? What do you want to achieve with your assessment or with your management strategy? So if you create an MPA, what is the target of this MPA? It will not just create something good by being there. So these targets are often formulated in, let's say, a rather fluffy way, which makes them extremely hard to measure in the first place. So have we reached our target? They are extremely hard to defend in the light of other uses. So if somebody tells me, if I do this, we can earn so and so much money, and we can offer so and so many jobs to people, and so on, and we can develop this community. I can't say that, but that is not conforming with this target. So I would like to discuss targets for biodiversity management, to actually bring them into policy negotiations, which where they have a right in themselves. And in the discussions I've been involved in, the target formulation for the marine biodiversity strategy often failed this primary goal of actually setting an agenda. So target setting is only one small thing, but it's one that were my two examples where I think we are why we are failing in achieving the IEG targets. We underestimate how complex biodiversity change is, and we underestimate how complex it is to define management practices which are actually working towards definable targets.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks a lot, both of you. We will then close this more seminar like part of our night session, and now we will open the floor to the public.